Great. Welcome back, everyone. Stephen had the challenge of speaking while people were hungry, and I have the challenge of trying to keep people awake after having had a very nice lunch. So let's see if we can fire things up here. So this is a panel on CBAM and the CSDDD. We trade people love our acronyms, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. These are initiatives in the European Union. And if we think back to what Ambassador Tai said this morning and also what Stephen Vaughan said right before lunch, we are really all struggling with how to adapt away from a version of globalization that put downward pressure on environmental and labor ambition. And so for the Americans here who aren't familiar with European vocabulary, sustainability for the Europeans usually covers both labor and environment. So that's what we're seeing with the Europeans, an effort to have these regulations, these directives that are going to help move away from that old model. What's interesting is a lot of American trade lawyers will be frustrated with the way the EU goes about its regulatory processes, and maybe not just Americans. We've heard some of that from Europeans as well. That there's something of a more closed process is often the critique that we hear about the European regulatory process, and so it's often exposed to critique not on the purpose of the regulations, but whether those regulations are practical for achieving those ends. So we're going to get into some of these issues. We had put this agenda together, and then there were some developments on the CSDDD recently as part of this conversation around simplification in Europe that makes it even more timely, and for my purposes is an issue that seems to run a little bit under the radar here in the United States. So we're really lucky. We have a panel full of people who can touch on all the different aspects of these issues. Yves Mélin, who is a partner with Cassidy Levy Kent in Brussels, so thank you very much. You were also on the de minimis panel, also the head of Confiad, so a confederation of customs brokers. I will say I am myself a lapsed customs lawyer. I have a world of respect for customs lawyers, especially in this day and age. We have Kelly Faye Rodriguez here from the Harvard Kennedy School. In the last administration, she was the U.S. Special Labor Representative at the Department of State. The first one we ever had, is that correct, Kelly?
First in 7 years.
First in 7 years, okay. Audrey Steenon from the Open Markets Institute, handling industrial policy, trade, and any other number of issues. And then Mike Williams from the Center for American Progress, formerly from the Blue-Green Alliance, that intersection, labor, climate, industrial policy. So this is the group that we have today. So Yves, let me start with you, since you actually live in Brussels and have a lot of experience with the conversation around CBAM, the conversation around the CSDDD. Have I been fair about the fight over how the Commission regulates? Is there anything you want to correct that I've said?
Yes, so glad to be on this panel again. But we are all frustrated about how Brussels regulate things. That's true. But in order to understand what's happening with those supply chain files, you have CBAM, you have also conflict minerals, you have battery regulation, you have the forced labor regulation, you have the CSDDD. You need to understand a bit how the European polity is evolving, and the role of the various institutions in adopting those rules. So I mentioned it in the panel before, to get any text coming from the EU, you first need to have a proposal by the European Commission. So our Congress, the combination of the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, where you have the member states, cannot have an initiative. So the initiative comes from the Commission. And the Commission is conservative, not with a capital C, but it lags a few years behind what elected officials want. And we've seen that, and I've been active in 25 years in Brussels, I've always seen that. And so we have today Commission officials who were appointed The officials themselves, they were appointed 20 or 30 years ago, but the elected part of the commission, they were appointed 5 years ago maximum. And so you have always, when they do things, it's always with a bit of a lag. And those files, before the politics in Europe are more right-wing today than they were. Just like the case in the US, anguish about migration and globalization, people don't like it so much anymore. So we have exact same phenomenon that happens in our member states and in the European Parliament. And in the European Parliament is one of these two institutions that have to agree on any text that comes from the EU. So when we have the CBAM, it has to be approved by both the Council and the Parliament. When we have the CSDDD has to be approved by both the Council and the Parliament. And it takes time. You need majorities on one side, you need a qualified majority on the other. And that's why it takes so much time. And now what we see for the first time ever, the Parliament was always ruled in the center by like a grand coalition, and everything was decided way in advance, and there was really no politics in the European Parliament. And now we have the right making alliance with the far right on certain files in the European Parliament, and supporting some of the changes that the European Commission wants. So that, I think, explains a bit the rolling back of certain of the policies that we have, combined with the pressure from the US to actually make those changes. So this pressure is having a big impact on the deforestation regulation, for instance, and on the CSDDD. There was this. So, in a nutshell, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, what it does, it imports into the EU law a discipline that was largely developed at the OECD of due diligence. And so you need to ask questions and document the answers, and then act upon the answers that you get on a series of environmental legislations, and then on a series of ILO conventions, International Labour Organization conventions that. So a series of questions you need to ask your suppliers, you document the answer, and then when you identify issues, you need to work on them and solve them, and you need to report, you need to have a hotline, you need to act upon the input that you receive from the hotline. In a nutshell, that's what the CSDDD does, and it was going to apply to a lot of companies, and now it's going to apply. There was an agreement between the institutions, I think, on Monday. This week, agreement that it would only apply to the biggest companies, 20% of the biggest companies. And so that's probably what's going to happen. It's going to enter into force, and it's going to be into force only for the biggest companies. What it will do is, when the EU adopts texts like this, it's to replace texts that exist at member state level. And Germany and France have their own text, and to the extent that it's not compatible with the EU text, they will have to amend it. So that's also one of the things the EU does.
Thank you so much for that overview, Yves. I really appreciate it. Audrey, I'm going to come to you because Yves mentioned a few things that are similar to something you just echoed in a piece you wrote for the Open Markets newsletter, that you've seen a strengthening of the right wing in the EU. You've seen U.S. pressure come to bear, and then this alliance between the center-right and the far-right over supply chains. So give us your reactions.
And so I think there's a bigger picture fight that's going on. And Catherine sort of started off this entire event by discussing that we're in the post-neoliberal age. There's a fight for what is the next paradigm, what is the next trade model going to be. There are two visions for that, and those two versions are currently fighting in Brussels about what that's going to be, because the aspiration was going to be that Brussels, as the United States retreated from a lot of the work of the past administration and presented a new vision for trade, that Brussels would be the defender of a more rules-based system. And so just to think about sort of what these two visions are, there is on one hand something that is represented by CBAM, the due diligence protocol, that is based on a lot of sort of older ways of thinking of trade in a positive way, right? In the sense that in order to have global impact, It is the responsibility, or a way of using trade is to try to help raise standards across the globe for the economy. And in doing so, you're thinking about what are the broader things that the economy is supposed to do. It's supposed to have labor standards, it's supposed to have environmental standards. We're supposed to try to reduce carbon emissions. And the way that you do that through trade is that you say any product entering our market must meet these standards. And if you are able to have products that meet these standards, you will have preferential treatment. You won't be paying the CBAM tariff coming in. You'll have maybe lower tariff rates for your country. That's sort of been the model of how you influence the globe. And so it's all about, raising the standard and trying to move us forward in that direction. Now you have this new vision coming out of the Trump administration, which also has global ambitions, trying to shape the way that the world works. And this one is strictly deregulatory. And this one, as opposed to trying to use market access as a way to try to get people to raise standards, uses tariffs as a mechanism to force countries to remove the regulation that we find U.S. companies don't want to comply with. And this is completely at odds with the idea that sort of underpins the trade system, that every country has the sovereign right to regulate their domestic markets. And that if you are a company from another country that comes into another market, you must obey the laws of that country. And that is a right based on the nation states and how the international system works. And Trump has figured out that he can go to any country in the world and say, we will levy these tariffs that will cripple your economy, unless you roll back these regulations that we don't like. Those regulations can be climate regulations, they can be tech regulations, they can be requirements that you give special contracts to Starlink, they can be requirements that you pay the pharmaceutical companies more, they can be requirements that the OECD agree to exempt US companies from the corporate tax minimum that was going to be applied across the world. And again and again and again, countries have been ceding to these demands, because the cost from the tariffs is so high. So these are these two visions. And again, there was this hope that Europe, as the second largest economy in the world, was going to be a defender and actually stand up to the administration. And what we're seeing in this, we have these two visions. There is still a neoliberal pro-business wing that has its interests and wants deregulation for the sake of deregulation, and the idea that if you benefit companies, eventually the benefits will trickle down to the rest of the economy, and that has vehemently been trying to attack these climate regulations on the trade side. A lot of these companies are American companies. One of the biggest lobbyists against the due diligence protocol was ExxonMobil. A lot of the biggest lobbyists against the tech regulations are American tech companies. And it is telling that, as Eva's mentioning, the center-right government leading the parliament was unable to get enough votes from the center and the center-left and the left wing to get their simplification deregulatory agenda passed, and they had to turn to the far right. And this is a major violation of democratic norms in Europe. And we're all Americans, and we're all sitting there. We've seen so many violations of democratic norms that it almost blows past us. But again, we are not doing well, right? This is not something that we want to see replicated across the world. And the idea, there is a rule that says that you are never, ever, ever supposed to vote with the far right, because they do not believe in the democratic process, and you're not supposed to empower these parties and let them into your coalition. And it has been upheld until now, and it is extremely telling that this is the issue that the center-right has caved on and been willing to break this norm in order to get that agenda through. Climate is the first on a host of policies that are coming down the pipeline to try to remove regulation. And now we're seeing this realignment of and this bigger question of, will Europe continue to be the defender of the democratic global economy when they have just taken the first major step at allowing this new unholy alliance between the far right and the pro-corporatist global elite?
That's really helpful, Audrey, especially really zeroing in on the different approaches. Do you want to raise standards? That's how you correct for the race to the bottom. We heard a lot about that this morning. Or is there downward pressure? So putting those clearly on the table as the two options. I'm interested because Stephen in his speech, explained why Republicans are Republicans, and one of the things he talked about was deregulation. And you did something I'm glad you did, which is to equate simplification with deregulation. These could be two different things. And Eve, you may want to weigh in on this, but this is part of the problem with the way the Commission goes about its regulatory approach. You may have duplicative requirements. You may have multiple forms to achieve the same point. It's hard to be against simplification. But when simplification is deregulatory, or simplification is a euphemism for deregulation, then you've really got a problem. And I think we're seeing a similar argument on the competitiveness side, where even the Bruegel crowd is screaming because the competitiveness agenda is being, I think, captured potentially by the deregulatory forces. So, Kelly, let me come to you. Audrey was talking mostly about the climate side, but we know that the dynamics are the same for labor. So I wonder if you could do two things for us. One, talk about the international labor side of it, which you've already written about, but tell us what's going on here at home on the labor side, since Audrey has talked about deregulation in the EU.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Really happy to be a part of this conversation. I think it's worth emphasizing CSDDD came about through years of debate and dialogue and consultation with various state actors, private actors, civil society. It was passed in 2024. When it passed, the U.S. government actually supported it because we believed at the time that it aligned with our trends in terms of understanding the importance of companies across the supply chain, from major brands all the way down to suppliers, playing a role in ensuring rights at the very bottom of the supply chain. That, we take responsibility, take action to try to address forced labor. Well over 28 million people in the world have been the studies have shown that there's over 28 million people subjected to forced labor as of several years ago. To make sure there's not union busting, criminalization of workers, wage theft, things that happen routinely in the global economy. Again, not just in the global south, but also happening in the global north. And we saw that the new due diligence directive really aligned with the model or the rationale for the USMCA, aligned with our forced labor trade policies, bipartisan policies, right? Again, that major corporations had a role to play in ensuring that rights weren't being trampled on at the bottom of the supply chain. And the reason for that is that we need to lift the ground for workers across global supply chains in the global economy. That is the only way that workers in the US and in Europe have a chance at also having their rights respected, having decent wages, and being able to negotiate for better standards. So, the attack on CSDDD through the omnibus alleged simplification really was attack on democracy in Europe, right? And labor stakeholders saw this new policy, the CSDDD, as really a lot of potential to be transformative for workers because it really just encouraged companies to work on systemic challenges that unions and labor activists have been working on for many, many years and could benefit from that collaboration, right? And so we've seen in the last 4 months in particular, U.S. companies, ExxonMobil, but also Chevron and Koch Industries, really lead the way in dismantling this law. And it's worth just mentioning the numbers here. So originally, CSDDD would cover all companies that had at least 1,000 employees and a turnover of 450 million euros. The weakening of the law that we saw in the law that was passed, the version that came out this week, brought that to companies that have 5,000 employees, which was the difference. Under the existing law, the estimates were that there would be about 3,400 companies that would be covered, and about 300 U.S. companies. Many companies in Europe supported the due diligence directive as it was passed in 2024, and we're defending it because they saw it as helpful, as consistent with the investments that they've been making for years to try to improve their supply chains, and it would help make sure there's it would help reverse the race to the bottom in standards. They wouldn't be undercut by companies that didn't mind if forced labor was occurring in their supply chain as long as they didn't have to pay attention to it, right? And so really a benefit for many companies, including many American companies. But we saw how a few powerful companies with the ear of the president then turned U.S. trade priorities into their own personal strategy to, again, undermine European democracy. Really concerning. I would say there's still aspects of the law to salvage for workers who are trying to organize and for companies that want to do the right thing. It was mentioned the UN guiding principles. The due diligence directive is really consistent with requirements that the UN has put out around what companies should be doing, and states to protect the rights of workers, and to ensure there's remedy for people's rights that have been violated. So we'll have to see how it plays out in the next week, but it has been really jarring and concerning to see the contradictions and conflict coming out of this administration on this issue.
Mike, I want to come to you in 1 second, but just want to get to see if Eve has a reaction. You have clients, you work with companies all the time. Kelly's described, and Ambassador Tai was talking about, normally businesses want some certainty and stability, but it seems like the way this has unfolded is the opposite of that. So is it correct for us to, we might assume that all businesses would be supporting this deregulatory effort. Seems like it's more complicated than that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to really know why all these things are happening, and I think my personal view is that it's happening because of the sentiment of insecurity that Europe is in right now. I don't know if it's felt here, but we're being attacked by Russia. Ukraine is attacked by Russia, and we're next, supported by China. Our energy sources are not secure anymore. And then the U.S. is to take NATO, it's yours. So it's unbelievably upsetting for Europeans, and it's been for a few years. And so we have a number of priorities. We need energy, and that energy can't be fossil. It has to be renewable or nuclear. And so everything the EU does that moves fast is in electrification, and it's happening. We need weapons. We need our own weapons, lots of them, happening. And in a sense, I think it's a good thing, because then we'll be ready whenever we are attacked, or we will never be attacked because we will be ready. And then you have all those supply chain files, and they survive to the extent, in my opinion, to the extent that either they support electrification or the tooling up in defense, like protecting steel and so either I've lost my line of thought.
The way they survive?
Yeah, they survive either because they support electrification, or they restore the level playing field. And so I think Europe is not in a shape right now to be, especially as the US has just dropped the issue, we're not secure enough to carry the baton and just transform how labor is done in China. I mean, we can't do that. But we need and we must protect our workers. And so we are going to make sure that the goods that come in are not going to be made through forced labor. We have a forced labor regulation entering into force next year. I think it's going to be used. Same thing with the deforestation regulation. It's going to be applied to the extent that goods coming in are cheaper because they are not respecting rules equivalent to European rules. And I think what's happening in Europe, it's a bit of a retreat. And we hear now more about European values. We used to be about human rights and global standards and values. I think we are no longer there. It's European values. We're not even sure Americans share those values. So that's what's happening in Europe. On the what's happening in the European Parliament, I mean, that's a pessimistic view. In my opinion, this was a body that was not democratic. There was no debate. Everything was decided before, and now right and far right talked, and it's right, conservative, and there's this group, and then there's the far right. The next thing that's going to happen is the left is going to also do the same thing. So we may have a real democracy in our elections, and I'm not that scared about the future of European democracy, because what's happening here, is to heed what the voters want at the end of the day. So I'm not that concerned. I think Europe for sure is not there. Doesn't feel. I mean, Europe is many things with lots of elections everywhere and meeting in the EU institutions. I don't think that how that cookie crumbles now is we are going to reform the world. Not ready for that, but we still want to uphold our values, so good labor standards, good environmental rules, and make sure that that is not undermined by goods coming in.
Thank you for that. Mike, this conversation has gone the way a lot of conversations go, which is Europeans and Americans obsess over Europeans and Americans. But you spend a lot of time thinking about the rest of the world and about climate and industrial policy in the context of the global South. How are you seeing the overall conversation in the wake of COP30?
Sure. Thanks, Beth. And again, really appreciate being on this panel of just incredibly smart people. Before I get to that, I do want to take a moment to interject around the U.S. companies engaging in debates in Europe. And I'm not going to make comment on the democracy and such, but I do want to just make a note that we shouldn't be too high-minded about why those companies are engaging and why the Trump administration was engaging. I think we should remember that Donald Trump asked for $1 billion from the oil and gas industry during the campaign, and they paid up. That Donald Trump asked for millions of dollars from the tech industry, and they paid up. Elon Musk paid tons and tons of money, and then all of a sudden, what's happening with the U.S. using its tariff leverage on Europe? So we shouldn't think this is just an ideology thing. Wanted to say that first. To your question, yeah, it is something where we often get into these discussions, the U.S. and Europe, and there's a rest of the world out there that has an opinion on this, and they have their own functioning democracies, their thriving economies, emerging economies, so on and so forth. In Brazil was the most recent meeting of the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations this year in Belém, and this issue of trade, climate, and industrial policy. I don't know if you say it truly came to a head this time, but it certainly was a wild and thriving discussion in Belém. And it's something where there was a strong debate around how the body at the UN that deals with the issue of the climate crisis should integrate this issue of trade and what they refer to as unilateral measures, unilateral trade measures, into solutions on the climate crisis. And they came to there were some agreements, and I say they because the United States has absconded from any sort of responsibility on the issue of the climate crisis. That's not even nice enough. We're actively trying to hurt every effort to solve the climate crisis, and so we didn't show up in COP30, which probably was for the best. But the debate around trade measures, where previously it involved the United States actions, our subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act and such, and we can get into that deeper if you would like, but it really was the EU defending its CBAM and the emerging economies laying claim to the need to develop and not be injured in a process. And so what came out was an agreement, the Belém, the Mutirão, is what they refer to, the collaborative agreement. And in it, the language is that any unilateral trade measure related to climate should not constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination. This is a reaffirmation of United Nations principle. It doesn't actually have any legal heft at the moment, although it has been moved from just preamble text, which I'm sure folks who've worked in these arenas know that there's preamble text where it's, like, yes, we care about this, kind of, to it's actually in implementation text where it's, oh, no, actually, we really do kind of have to care about this now. So it has moved to that point, but there is not a legal connection to it, nor is there a work program around it. So it is a deeply important issue to nations around the world that are not U.S. and EU. It's a deeply important issue to the South Africans and the Indians whose steel industries are nowhere near as clean as the Europeans or the Americans. And it's something where, should European workers be at the threat of losing their jobs just to ensure that allow for Indian steel workers to have work? I think it's an honest debate, and I would land on the place of support the working people as best you can. So, like, German steelworkers should not lose their jobs so that we can pollute more, so that Indian steelworkers can have jobs. There should be a way to provide and support for both, and we can do that. And I think the EU, in stepping forward with the CBAM first, is starting to plow a road there, although just taking a beating while doing it. And so they did so in Brazil. And so there's just a significant amount of debate and dialogue that's going to be upcoming. The COP30 decision created, there was a creation of a dialogue around trade and climate for the first time. They're going to have, work sessions in Bonn, Germany. Again, not a work program, but work sessions where they're eventually going to produce a report. So again, UN speak to talk about things that they need to talk about. That said, there is a work program on just transition. And a number of the emerging economies are going to be using that space to try to impact trade policies from other nations. So the Just Transition Work Program is a place where I expect that folks from large emerging economies especially will try to see if they can engage their counterparts, especially with the EU, and then maybe once the U.S. decides to care about the climate crisis again, us as well.
Thank you for that, Mike. In the conversations I've been in with some of the emerging economies and the EU, one of the impressions you get is the hangover of colonialism, really feeling like CBAM and the CSDDD are an extension of a colonial model. And to my mind, colonial policy was bad for working people in the colonies. So it's not so much the actual policy, it's the feeling that they are being dictated to. On the other hand, there are economies that want to make sure they are regulating for climate, that they're protecting their workers. And if you're going to move us away from the race to the bottom, you're going to have to be able to take some measures to protect your market. So that is also part of the real challenge of solving for the supply chain problems in the context of all these other discussions. Kelly, I don't know, you spent a lot of time with emerging economies in your role in the last administration on a really sensitive issue, which is labor. What can you tell us that helps us think through how to move forward?
I spent a year and a half living and working in Bangladesh with garment workers, supporting worker organizing and unions, and saw repeatedly, how efforts to raise standards from the ground were attacked and undermined. And I mentioned criminalization of workers happens routinely all over the world, and so there is this contradiction of seeing foreign, European and American, Western corporations employ these extractive models of dictating the terms of production such that workers really, it's almost impossible for them to negotiate decent standards and a livable wage, and yet relying on civil society, international and global unions and relationships, and some government actors, when they credibly appear, to be able to counter those measures and to speak up and to find opportunities to exercise their rights and I mean, as workers always will, find a way to organize, to try to improve their lives. We saw that with the Bangladesh Accord, that enforceable models work, that when there are requirements, when brands are at the table with unions, that conditions can improve. And again, along the lines of enforceable agreements and proactive trade agreements where companies have a real reason to make sure that the rights of the workers throughout the supply chain are respected, that those can work. And yeah, frankly, there's a lot of questions now about what that's going to look like in a new trade regime where we have these forced labor requirements in the reciprocal agreements, yet the gutting of resources for workers. I mean, over $700 million that the Trump administration has cut in global labor programming and support. The challenge is only getting harder for workers and unions who are trying to raise the floor across global supply chains, build on that solidarity, and show that there's another model, that it doesn't have to be neoliberal trade only.
I would be remiss if I did not make a plug for the reporting that came out of the Capitol Forum to show exactly how much of a drop-off we've seen in enforcement of imports made with forced labor here in the United States, which gets back to your point, Audrey, about what model do you have? Is it deregulatory or regulatory? Yesterday, Ambassador Greer at the Atlantic Council said that the EU has a habit of exporting its regulations, but this conversation seems to suggest the United States is back in the business of exporting deregulation. Mike, you wanted to come in, I think.
I mean, I think the way I understood that comment was there's this fight in the U.S. or this perception from the Republican Party in the U.S. that says if any other country regulates our companies, that's them infringing on our sovereign right to regulate our companies. And since we as a country have decided not to regulate these industries, anyone who goes above our non-existent regulations and is infringing on our rights. And therefore, we're going to go and use tariffs and attack those regulations until they bring them back down to our non-existent standard. And that's the current trade policy of the United States in terms of using its tariffs. And so, yeah, like the comment yesterday was, we will regulate our own companies. And we will not outsource the process of regulating them, and that's extremely concerning.
So Ambassador Tai, in pushing us this morning to actually think about what could be different and how we could do this differently, it's something I've been thinking about as well, and it, again, had me thinking. And one of the core questions we should ask ourselves when we try to decide what a better trade order should be is, why do we do these things? Why do we make these decisions? Why do we want to put in place tariffs, or why do we want to invest in so on and so forth? And we should have real concrete answers around that. And I think, and I'll get to what I think they should be, but I think it's important to properly critique this current U.S. administration, because I think they don't want to be honest about why they are taking these positions. They hide behind the guise of competitiveness, which is an ephemeral thing when you dig down to it. But the actual answer, I think, would be to profit make and then, make more in certain ways as well. But I think if we're honest with ourselves in creating a values-based system, we should be, again, approach these issues of multilateral discussions, of trade debates, and say that, the United States, we're going to create an industrial policy because we care about our national security, because we care about the economic security of working people, because we actually want to solve the climate crisis as well. And so we develop that, and we develop a trade policy that is around that and those values. And we are allowing ourselves to operate that way, but then try to collaborate with other economies around the world so that they can do similar things. So it can be a collaborative method to allow for others to to inject their own industrial policies into this equation. But we really should start with the question of, why do we do these things?
and I was given permission to be a bit provocative before we started this panel, so thank you, Beth. We've had a few visions of what is exactly the purpose of the current administration's policies, and what they say, it's about raising wages, increasing manufacturing and jobs in the U.S. and reducing the deficit.
Does any of that happen, Audrey?
Yeah,
Sorry.
well, so and then everyone's like, why is it so inconsistent? And why is that not happening? And I think there's this unspoken, what is the actual policy and what is the actual goal? And so this is the provocative part. In my mind, the underlying goal of the current administration is authoritarian takeover of the U.S. democratic system. And what I mean by that, being used by trade policy being used for that, is that trade is being used as a mechanism to punish people who are not aligned with the administration and reward those who are. So those who have provided money for the ballroom and provided money for the the campaigns and all the various things and showed up with gold plinths and glass whatever gifts, bribes, they get exempt from tariffs. They get the U.S. trade negotiators to go on their behalf to Europe and try to get regulation removed on their behalf or taxes removed on their behalf. And so you, as a business, you make money by aligning yourself behind this regime. If you speak out, you will get tariffed. And so the same pressure tactics that we're seeing against other countries are also being applied to American businesses. And all of that is contributing to the continual concentration of power around the presidency and around Donald Trump as an individual, and it's exceptionally dangerous, and it's why it is so important that there be more of a pushback from other governments and other countries to recognize that there is a transnational anti-democratic effort that the current administration is wielding the strength of the American economy to try to advance.
Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Just to be extra clear, weakening CSDDD is not going to raise wages in the U.S. If anything, we've seen the UAW bring a case against German companies under the German Supply Chain Act for violations of rights in the United States, right? Weakening efforts by other countries to try to ensure standards are at a minimum is only going to hurt American workers. And so, yeah, I agree 100% with what she said.
One thing I find interesting, and Audrey, the way you've described the upshot of Ambassador Greer's remarks yesterday, is the implications for us vis-a-vis China. So if the position of the United States is our companies can't be regulated by anybody other than us, what does that mean for our China policy? And the China aspect of it is relevant to this conversation in another way, which is where the supply chain is concentrated. That's what we learned during the pandemic. It's in the PRC. So if you are weakening the European efforts to try to raise the floor, aren't you perpetuating the existing dynamics that allows so many of those supply chains to be concentrated in China? And in that way, Eve, I think it does end up meaning that Europe has some tools to at least avoid the race to the bottom on forced labor versus being able to solve the whole problem. I don't know if anybody has reactions to that, but really the next panel is on China. How should we think about all of this in the context of China?
Also, first to react on, I do not think that CSDDD was diluted because of ExxonMobil. It is because of European politics, first and foremost. And China, how the EU relates to China, I think we have with China the same issues that you do. So we have globalization has created vulnerabilities, and we need to reverse them. And I think we are going to reverse them for strategic industries. And the EU is now working on identifying them, agreeing on what they are with the member states. And we are going to have a series of industries where we are going to take back some of the efficiencies that globalization has allowed, and create inefficiencies by reshoring some of that production. I think the Europeans are torn between the China opportunity, especially as the U.S. opportunity reduces, and the threat that China represents, and I think China is more a threat than an opportunity. When you put things on the left and the right side of the ledger, it's a threat. Xi Jinping has spent 3 days in Moscow to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and when our president of the European Commission goes to Beijing, she can't meet him. And they are sending technology and money to help them build drones. And so this is at the core of everything for Europeans. And also to react to what you just said about the US, Europe, I was very positively impressed by how the EU stayed calm and handled Trump, right? So there's an agreement, it's being implemented. We have agreed to revisit some of our policies on tech in particular. I don't think we have agreed to what Stephen Vogt said earlier. We have not. One of the elements of our security that we haven't discussed before, it's tech and AI, and that's going. We need European tech. We need a European cloud. It can't be Microsoft. It can be American companies. It can be Chinese companies, and we need to be able to send satellites ourselves. So anytime this touches that, you are going to see. And if the U.S. tries to prevent us from doing it, we are going to clash. There's also a different perception on what the freedom of speech means. And there's a feeling that it's being used in the U.S. as a way actually to not to spread untruth, and specifically in the European debate to try to promote far right. That is a red line for everybody. But the far right, which is 10-15% of the elected officials, so that is a major issue. And I don't think that we are not going to prevent lies to be spread online by American companies in Europe. We are going to do it. How could we do it without exciting the Trump administration? I think we should first try to find the commonalities, what we agree on, and protect children. I think everybody agrees with that. And also we should go after the Chinese companies first. Not go after the American, the GAFAs, but go after China first. That would go a long way, I think, to keep the momentum so that we don't revert to duties. Do we have time to speak about the CBAM or not?
Go.
Yeah?
Go right ahead.
Because I wanted to say a word about the CBAM. The CBAM is unlike the other files. It's going to happen. It's going to happen with a vengeance, and it's going to happen because we need to tax imports of products made with lots of oil and gas in order to take the money and give it to our industries so that they electrify. So, and in there you have a climate objective, which I think is becoming a secondary in why it's staying, and you have an energy independence objective. So that is a very different file. And if you, I've been looking at the CBAM up close. So I don't, the COP, I read about the COP, but the CBAM, I go into the meetings and I see how it's being discussed, implemented, how the steelmakers complain, how the foreign steelmakers complain, how the customer representatives say, hey, that's never going to work. And it's going to happen. It's going to be very costly for companies that don't investigate their carbon footprint in the right way, under the EU method. So that's a steep learning curve. And as long as you don't know, you're going to have to pay default values that are super high. And it's a very good example of a simplification that is not regulation. When it was first floated, the CBAM was a purely declarative system. So you would have thousands, tens of thousands of importers say, oh, there is this much carbon in my product, and control would have happened years after the fact. Unenforceable. We are back to the e-commerce mess, where you can't control, so nobody complies. And the Commission heard this, and they have just announced recently that they are going to actually impose the default values by default, and only allow actual emission values to be used if there is an on-the-spot verification by your third-party verifier. So that is a simplification. That is reducing risk for importers, increasing the revenue for the EU, fighting climate change, and electrifying the European economy. So the CBAM is an interesting file, and to be completely distinguished from the others because it generates this revenue for electrification.
So it's evolved with the circumstances. Do you have a response on the issue of the grievances of emerging economies?
We have complicated relationships with developing countries, obviously, and the colonial past is not that far, especially in Africa. Now, when you look at developing countries like India or China, I mean, we're dealing with competitors and economies that challenge us. And so the Indians will complain that we can't impose the CBAM for this and that. Decarbonize. Stop buying Russian oil and expect that we are going to import your goods into the EU at the expense of European jobs. And so there's nothing that India or anybody can say about the CBAM, for instance, in particular, that's going to change the EU. Decarbonize, and the EU has created mechanisms for bilateral cooperation, which it had to do because essentially the COP in Madrid, I forgot which one it was, the EU realized it was alone in really trying to impose a mechanism that was going to tax emissions. So I don't think the EU is going to be moved much on the complaints of that part of the developing world. I think there will be some simplifications for Africa and countries that really struggled. First, don't account for a lot of emissions, and then would struggle to put in place the carbon accounting required. I think that will happen, but we will only know next week how that will look like, because next week we have like 10 implementing a delegated act being published just 2 weeks before the entry into force. So.
Can I jump in really
Yeah,
quick? Because
go ahead.
one other interesting thing in BLM around the EU CBAM is that China was not a lead in the complaining department or in the critiquing department because for the last number of years, China has actively started to decarbonize big chunks of its steel industry. And I have heard from folks who work in China, as well as folks who work with China, that the EU CBAM was a driver of that decision-making. It wasn't the whole driver, of course, but it was a driver of that decision-making. So Brazil is actively working to decarbonize its steel industry. So there's truth to the effectiveness of this.
And just rather than try to change how others do things, we are the second or the biggest market, I don't know, depending on how you measure it. We are one of the biggest markets. The US is one of the biggest markets in the world. We can leverage our domestic markets to influence the rest of the world. And if the EU has Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and a few other countries, Canada, and then maybe the US next, with the next administration, and then you say my markets are going to create incentives for decarbonation and for the end of forced labor, it is going to have an impact by necessity.
We're at time, but they're not being super strict. So if anybody else wants to jump in, or we can, yeah.
Make one final point on China. And I think this ties to the CBAM as well, right? The CBAM is very often or continually pitched like this is a climate policy, not an economics policy. That its goal is climate, and so in many the fact that more countries are adopting and regulations or standards to reduce carbon emissions is the point. And I know I've heard that if it collects zero revenue, that would be the goal, because that means that everyone has raised their standards to that degree. So that's a fantastic outcome as it's moving forward to that. What it doesn't address, and this is the China issue, and Europe is fantastic in that they have managed to compartmentalize their policies, so they actually do answer this in other ways. But what CBAM itself doesn't address is the hyper-concentration of production in China and the advantages that China manages to accrue through that concentration. And I think it's important to recognize that in this new global economy, there are two countries in particular who are acting like monopolists of certain sectors, right? The US has monopolized tech and finance. China has monopolized a good chunk of the green industries. And both of those countries are going to act in ways to defend that monopoly and that control over those markets. And so to allow for a green transition that actually creates and to make sure that the world is able to access all the technology that it needs to access in order to make this transition possible, putting all of that production in one country has enormous risks. This is what we saw in the pandemic. And so we need to see more countries putting whatever trade policies, industrial policies, potentially partially protectionist measures to diversify that production and make sure that it is pulled out of China's grasp for the sake of diversifying that risk. And Europe plays a very big part of that fight.
Do you want to go, Kelly?
Yeah, quickly. So I have many questions for Yves, but there's a lot of discussion domestically about how our historic neoliberal trade, and the economic insecurity it's produced for American workers has led to an increase in sort of extreme people being susceptible to right wing, far right wing, and undemocratic political agendas. I've heard from European stakeholders similarly that particularly in Germany, where there's recently increasing economic insecurity, it has created this pressure that has led to people being more susceptible to far right wing politics. And I'm curious. I mean, you had mentioned the intent to address forced labor. While the EU regulation is important, it is not going to end forced labor. And CSDDD, I think, was an important policy, still is, but certainly is not going to raise labor standards in the global South to European labor standards. So I'd be curious to know, how you see that strategy moving in terms of protecting standards for domestic workers within the European Union, and how do you do that if you're not taking more proactive steps to encourage standards externally?
My very personal view on this
Yeah.
is this sentiment of insecurity that a lot of the electorate feels somehow prevents them from being generous towards workers abroad, right? So when you look at the populist on the far left and the far right, maybe more on the far right than the far left, they don't care about the labor standards so much of foreigners. They want good labor standards domestically, and I think. If one cares about labor standards abroad, we first need to think about labor standards domestically, because then otherwise you're just not elective, right? So it's and both are not incompatible. As I said, I think the European market is big enough that if you demand compliance with the ILO conventions on no child labor, no forced labor, right to unionize, etc., you're going to have an impact. For at least for part of the production that ends up in Europe, which is 20% of whatever is produced in the world,
Yeah.
you account for 25%. So that's a lot.
It's a start.
Okay, well, we will leave it at that. Thank you so much. Hopefully, we kept our word, and people are awake after lunch. And especially thank you to Eve, because I've been doing this for a long time, and being the Brussels person on a panel full of Americans isn't always easy, but it was great. Anytime. All right.